Well, happy Memorial Day. Um, Got a flag folded up here for you guys. This is how they fold it at the end of the day on all the military bases I was ever stationed in. But how it works, for those of you that haven't experienced that, how it works in all our services, Coast Guard to the Marine Corps, is in the morning the flag goes up and you hear a trumpet, and then in the evening the flag goes down, and wherever you are walking, you might be by yourself walking between different things there on the base, and the trumpet sounds and you're to stop and salute till it's done. And it's kind of a daily conditioning that kind of gets to you, you know, and you become hopefully more patriotic. So flags are a symbol for all of us about what people have done. Certainly their sacrifices, right? The red. I mean, if you know the history of the flag, the red is for the blood that's spilled, and it has a lot to it. And so I have a lot of patriotic feelings, and probably you do too. And maybe some of you are growing into that. I guarantee if you're in the military, they'll work on that for you. But so it's a day of memorial, and I understand they opened a new memorial downtown. It's next to the Amtrak station down there. They've had it for a while, but they did a centerpiece down there, and they have names on there now. I remember the first time I saw the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C. when they first opened it. I was stationed back there, and I remember walking up and looking at this cast iron Marine, and he was in, and it was close enough to when I was serving that I was actually wearing on a daily basis the same clothes that that man in the cast iron was wearing. I mean, I didn't look so different on a daily basis, and it just reminded me that that's us. I was reminded again as my little brother, and have talked about him many times, Major Maddox now, back in Iraq for I don't know the umpteenth time again, back over there. But I am thankful for him, and he is thankful that he can serve. I like going to memorials because it kind of puts the wind back in my sails about living better. I tell people it's a little morbid. When I go to cemeteries, I sort of like it. Odd, I know. But it does. It kind of puts the wind in my sails again. And we are getting familiar with wind these days. Have you guys noticed? Some wind is friendly and some wind is way over the top. But yesterday, when I got my new kite and went across the street to fly it, there was no wind. It was kind of like, whew, like that. And I bought a kite you can't tear, a nice one, you know, the nylon thing. And I thought, man, I'm going to have a cool moment here. Wasn't that cool? So now today, I could fly it. And, you know, my wife was so gracious. She's behind the pole. There she is. We went across the street, and they lock our little grade school up across the street from our house because vandals like me and stuff, I don't know. But anyway, we had to climb the fence. She climbed a fence yesterday. She's pretty, yeah. I don't know if you climbed one of those fences at the grade school. They're a little tougher, you know. They're not your average fence. So I want to talk to you a little bit about wind today, hopefully in a favorable sense. And this morning's scripture reading is in John chapter 3. John chapter 3. And if you don't have a Bible, the black one's there. We'll follow along just fine. It's the NIV or the TNIV. Either one is just fine. John chapter 3, and then I'll also read out of John 19. John chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, reads like this. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi, we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him." In reply, Jesus declared, "I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again." "How can a man be born again when he is old?" Nicodemus asked. "Surely he cannot enter a second time into his mother's womb to be born." Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth, no one ever entered the kingdom of God unless he is born of the water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, 'You must be born again.' The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." And then in chapter 19 of the same book, chapter 19, verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two men wrapped it with the spices in the strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a tomb, a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Pray the Lord would add a blessing to the reading of his word. I want to talk to you this morning about being born again, if that's all right. And I want to just echo Jesus' statement, you must. You must be born again. I've got about 4 points. The first one, and there is a spot in the Weekender, I looked, and there's a section for you to write there. And really the 4 points are everybody and everything, born again. What's it mean? Total change, why it happens, and then how it looks. Everybody and everything, point 1. Total change, point 2. Point 3, why it happens, and 4, how it looks. Probably most of us have heard the term born again. I think I might have had a bumper sticker on my car at one point. It was really popular back in the 70s and 80s to use that kind of term. So what I think we need to do is talk about that thing, those words, born again. And try and get at what Jesus originally meant when he said it. I mean, I think that's what we do here, is we try to see what Jesus would say to us. When you think of born again, I think most people think of someone who needs some extra help, or you really might think of a type of person. A person that's emotional, broken, needs some cathartic sort of activity, very disoriented, moral guidance needed, structure, brokenness, addictions, moral authority, needs some kind of moral authority. So that's kind of in some people's heads, that's what born again means. It's for those type of people. Well, not according to this story. Nicodemus, the guy who comes to Jesus, is a ruler in the Sanhedrin. I don't think he would be a ruler if he didn't have some stability in his life. Probably emotionally stable, intellectually stable, financially stable, surface to the top of the echelon. In those days, Jews Religion was combined with government for them, basically. So he was really religious, political, upper echelon in his community. That's who he was. Professional, successful. He was successful. He was a successful man in all sense of the word. A Pharisee, that was really the ruling party. That was the party, the more conservative party religiously. And so he was part of that party. The Pharisees worked at the hundreds of laws you find in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in there. There's the beginnings of the law for Sabbath and all kinds of things. About 632, 33, something like that. Little laws to do. They worked at it. So he was at the top of his profession. He just wasn't a Pharisee. He was an upper echelon Pharisee. Emotionally stable, not really a needy kind of guy. Just well-adjusted, open-minded. He came to Jesus, open-minded, called him rabbi. Hey, teacher. Curious, came at night, didn't want to be associated, wasn't sure about that crew, but was sure he was curious enough to go and talk to him. Highly, highly religious, highly traditional. Probably in one sense perfectly happy. I'm fine. But curious. Interesting. Perfectly fine person. Perfectly emotionally, intellectually, financially, community-wise adjusted person. Not in trouble morally. So, this man, according to Jesus, needed to be born again. Needed something that he was having difficulty understanding. Some big change that he had to have. So I said all that to say this. It doesn't really matter what tradition you come from. I come from Roman Catholic and Baptist and a little bit of Pentecostal. So I have a hybrid upbringing. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're Russian, Eastern, Orthodox, Greek. It doesn't matter what language you're speaking, where you're at in the world right now. It doesn't matter. All people, everything, according to Jesus, everyone has to be born again. And if Nicodemus needs to be born again, that means everybody. So that's what Jesus was saying to him. Everybody does. Not just someone who is broken and in trouble. Certainly, yes, but not just that. So what does born again mean? What is the second point there? What does it mean? Well, I said it means total change. And I would like to talk to you about what the gospel does when it's at work in us. At work in us. Now, I want to say to you this morning is that I'm not talking about just religious, I'm talking about something deeper than that. Because, Nicodemus was highly religious. But he was missing everything somehow. So, total change. I would say it's two things under that point, and you could write these down, is spiritual equality. We have spiritual equality with everyone. Everyone. And the other part of that change is that everybody needs to experience death and resurrection. Okay. Spiritual equality. So, some years back, I'm a minister, so if you decide to pass away, I'll be there. I mean, if you come to me before, that's a little weird. But I mean, if you pass away, I will do your funeral for you. If I pass away, I'd like you to show up to mine. If you want to get married, I'll do that too, or Ed will do that, or we'll shoot somebody at you and do that too. If you have a baby, we'll probably show up if we can. Not at a bad time, hopefully, just sometime after the birth. And so I got invited to do a wedding. And this wedding happened to be in Mexico and happened to be in Baja, Mexico, and a little ways down the coast in Baja. I don't know who has been down in Baja, but you have to go through Tijuana and make your way out of Tijuana. I still remember being in an alley going, where am I at? And looking at these taxi guys, and I was going, whoa, man, I'm going to die, weird stuff. But we made our way down into Baja, and we get down in there, and we're at a place called Las Rocas. It's a fabulous hotel, and we're there for a wedding. There's some people coming to this wedding, a couple hundred. It's going to be a pretty big shindig all the way down in Mexico. So I get down there, and I'm at Las Rocas, and my wife and I, and it's kind of cool. We got a couple nights in a hotel. Pretty groovy. We don't say groovy, I know that, but it was pretty groovy. So Karen and I are down there, and it's one of those hotels. I mean, the rooms, it's made out of really blue rock and just beautiful rooms. And then out on the edge, there's 2 giant pools that have glass where you can look out on the glass out into the ocean, and the rock face right there looks like La Jolla in San Diego. I mean, it's just pristine and beautiful coast right there. And there's 2 pools. You can go to either one. And then there's people out there giving you massage, and then there's, drink things and people running around serving you, and pretty nice. So I like that. But I still remember pulling out of the hotel and facing our car straight across the street and looking at a ghetto like I'd never seen. And it was terrible. And I still remember the feeling, the gut feeling I have, you might use the word disparity or difference in the luxury that we were stepping out of, and then just looking at squalor and poverty in a terrible way. Right, 20 feet across that highway. There it was. You sort of get bends from those experiences. You know what bends are when you're diving and you come up too fast? They say that you get oxygen in your bloodstream and it causes bends. It really can hurt you, kill you. When you go from one thing to an opposite, and it kind of shocks your system. So Jesus seemed to do a lot of that. From a despairing situation to the lap of luxury, and seemed to be comfortable in both. What I want to say is, for all of us people, because of Jesus, we have total spiritual equality, human equality with everyone, no matter what side of the road they're on. Financially, educationally, racially, all in total, because of Jesus. The ground is, as one old preacher said, the ground is totally level at the cross. Totally. We have spiritual equality. The gospel does that. It levels everything. It takes down what needs to be taken down. I mean, I guess Jesus could have told Nicodemus, look, here's a couple more things that you could add to your resume. Here's how you can clean up. Here's 5 more cool rules to do, Nick. But he didn't. He just said, you need to be born again. That's the cool thing about Jesus. Religious people and non-religious people both need to be born again. They both need the same thing. Odd. So, and which leads us really to this morning asking ourselves, if we need to be born again, then what does it mean? Why do we need to be born again? And I would say, what is your understanding of sin? Great word, sin. I'm working with a young girl on being baptized and understanding Jesus, and we're talking about the word sin a lot. She said, that's a weird word. What does that mean? So I try to explain it. Really, the Bible, when it talks about sin, really is talking about the center of your life, what you're absorbed on, what is your true God. Is it God or is it something else? Let me put it this way. There's two ways to not know God. One is to be very, very, very good. And that can be a total self thing. I feed the poor. I could be very, very good. Look at me. It can be, I've sat in places, I've done it myself, I'm sure, where there's a self-focus. So I can be very, very good, or I could be very, very bad. I could be super bad. They're both self-absorbed lifestyles. And because I'm very, very good, God needs to bless me. And when God doesn't, I have a little issue going on. Because I'm very, very good. And Nicodemus was very, very good. And the bad living, both are self-centered. One says, look, let me show you how good I am. The other said, get in my way and I'll kill you. But they're both the same thing, basically. They both need a shift in centers. Nicodemus needed a shift in center off of religious performance to gospel, to Jesus. The center has to change. I think in this group here, we probably have a fair mix of some of you that grew up inside a church and some of us, moi, that grew up outside the church. And if you grew up outside the church, sometimes you come in and you have a radical change. And the people that grew up inside the church, it's a little less visible, but nevertheless, the change is the same thing. There is born again going on inside the church and born again going on from the outside. The point is still the same. It's like the wind, everything just changes, and you know it's happening to you because you begin to let go of your ego, and begin to be more focused on God and your neighbor. It just kind of rolls that way when it happens. The second thing is the on the spiritual equality and total change is there is death and resurrections that must occur for all of us. Egos die. Is anybody here married? Okay, your ego will suffer some blows in your marriage. Lots of them, and sort of never ending. And that's okay. Because it's important. It's always odd to tell people to be humble. Because then you start acting humble, right? Anyway, and because Jesus was amazingly humble and strong at the same time. Very disarming. Very upsetting. I think of an illustration from AA. Anybody know who AA is? Okay. There's a guy named Andrew Delbanco who decides to go. He's investigating some different things. He's writing a book. And he goes to an AA meeting, and it's in the basement of a church. And he goes to the AA meeting and sits down, and happens to be in New York. And there's a young man that's up front. If you've been to AA, there's speakers. People speak at recovery meetings. And so there's a young man speaking, and the young man is talking about all the people that hurt him, how he needs to take charge of his life, how he's going to hold other people accountable for all they've done, but I'm not drinking. And the man that was checking out the meeting, Andrew, was sitting next to an elderly African-American gentleman, looked to be about 40 and had some huge dreadlocks and had sunglasses on. And so this young man is chattering away. And the guy next to him, Andrew, African-American gentleman, gives him the elbow, and he pulls down his sunglasses and he says, I used to feel like that till I achieved low self-esteem. Now I'm better. What that man said, what that man tapped into, is the doctrine, really, from the church of sin as self-absorption, self-centeredness, self-in-control. And that pride has to die. Pride has to go away. I was sitting in a small group with some men just recently. I like this group. I'm sitting in a small group with men. And it was amazing how humble all of us had become over the years. Now, don't be amazed at your humbleness, because that's how you lose it. The monkey, it's like a ride, isn't it? Anyway, it was just kind of, okay, let me zero this in. Humble comes from hummus, not the Jewish dip that we eat. No, I mean, it comes from dirt in the Bible. It means dirt, humility, earthiness, down to earth, all that kind of related stuff. And anyway, we were talking in the group, and we were talking about difficult things. And sometimes you get some things going. We called it holy despair. Just frustration with things and people. It can't change. And that, in fact, that was a good thing. Because we were attempting to bring those things to God. And certainly everybody has things that they might despair about. Frustration that reaches a emotional level. And that is not a bad thing. It actually moves you towards God. And moves you away from self, because you can't find the solution. I don't know the solution. Don't know. Can't find it. So, but it feels sometimes, going along with Jesus, feels like occasional deaths to ourselves. But the wonderful thing about when the wind of the Spirit shows up is amazing release of pride. And you know you release your pride when you're not really worried about what anyone's thinking. You're just doing life, just following Jesus. I think of another man, 500 years back from the man at the AA meeting in New York. This man's name was Luther. Luther had a lot of frustrations in life. He had a tough relationship with his daddy. This is Martin Luther, the reformer. Tough relationship with his dad. Became a monk instead of his lawyer. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer. Became a monk and was a painful monk. He was monkey, he was kind of a painful guy. He was always frustrated with the relationship with God. Went to Rome and climbed steps on his knees, went to confession nonstop, did all kinds of stuff. And then one day he was teaching the Bible to other people, as religious guys like us do, and he read Romans 1:17. And it said this: the just shall live by faith. The righteousness of God is revealed as the just live by faith. And he said he realized in that moment that his life had been built on himself, and that he actually needed what Jesus did for him. He actually needed the grace. And Luther said, it was as though I was born again. And his life was never the same after that. That was really the spark of the Reformation. So, an Augustinian monk who himself achieved low self-esteem. Same thing, different place, different words. So why is it possible? So total change, and then the third point, why is it possible? Birth is messy business, is it not? Even with all the nice hospitals that we have here, it's still messy. It's still a surprise. And if you could think, if you could just launch back and think about no hospitals, nobody, and women giving birth. And the mortality rate, the death of women was really high, about half and half. So often the woman paid for that child to live by her life. in birth. So when Jesus talked about birth and being born again, people listened. Said, that's serious. Something's going on here. But today, the messiness of birth, we have a lot of anesthetics. We have epidural. We have Lamaze. And anyway, we have a lot of things to help women get through those things. And but there is this messiness of birth. And here's the deal. Nicodemus is not the one going through the birth. Jesus is going through the birth. Jesus is the one who's paying the price for Nicodemus to have the grace. The birth is on him. The cross is the birth of the new world. It's everything. It doesn't matter what tradition we're talking about. We're talking about Christ. He paid for the birth. I'm thinking of the same gospel over in chapter 16. Little interesting thing. In chapter 16, he's talking to the disciples. John's gospel is very different, very personal, very intimate. And he's talking in chapter 16 to the disciples in verse 21. He says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of the joy that a child is born into the world. I think that's pretty true. Most women are pretty happy when it's all over. They're a happy bunch. And then verse 22, Jesus looks at the disciples and says, so with you, now is your time of grief. But I will see you again, and you will rejoice. And no one will take away your joy. What was Jesus saying? He says, now is your time of grief. I'm getting ready to do it. The thing I came to do, to die. It's your time of grief. You will grieve me, your friend. And so, the cost of our faith is always on him. And I think that's why Jesus said, the wind comes, you don't know where it comes from. That's why you can't fly a kite without the wind. That's why spiritual growth is the wind of the Spirit in our life. That's why a lot of time we're just getting our kites ready, because I'm waiting for the next wind. And I'd like you guys to experience some wind of the Spirit. I pray this summer, that the wind of the Spirit would flow into your sails in some way. Some of you haven't seen the wind in a while or felt it. You know, I found the wind at VBS. You know, you're working with little kids and stuff, and they're snotty and stuff. But you know, the wind was there. Yeah. I found the wind in the oddest spots. Youth camps, children's camps, VBSs, all kinds of odd places where the wind seems to show up and do exactly what I need it to do. Let me tell you this about that. We set up to do ministry things and be Jesus to our community, right? We're saying, come, we'll teach your kids about Jesus, and we set up to do that. Nothing we do is perfect. You know why? Because we're doing it. And I'm involved. Humans. That's why it's kind of funny to me when people critique the Bible and they say, well, you know, humans were involved in writing that. Yeah. But somehow God works through it. It's sort of the same way with all the stuff we do. You just have to trust him to work through it and do what you need to do. Because I think when the wind shows up and the kite takes off and you take off, it is absolutely the best thing. And I have seen 80-year-olds take off from the wind of the Spirit. I've seen 8-year-olds and everybody in between. But just trust that God can do what you need done in your life. He will change everything totally. So, final point. How do you know if you're born again? I've talked about this, the necessity, and that it changes you and all of that, and have, I believe, experienced that myself and continue to experience it, is we go to John chapter 19, and I read it to you at the beginning. And in John 19, we discover two guys. It's Joseph of Arimathea. Everybody knows about that, but this is the only gospel that records Nicodemus being there too. You know what's really amazing is that these two old ruling Jews, the ones who had just really killed Jesus, the two old ruling Jews off the board, the church board, showed up to the Romans and said, "Can we have it? We'd like his body." He was already under suspicion. There was already Roman guards there trying to make sure Jesus pulled no weird things, to keep this movement kind of rolling. And these two older Jewish leader guys, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, show up and ask for Jesus' body. That's some bold stuff. That's like coming out of the crowd and say, "Could we have him?" And what's interesting in that is that what do they do? What do they do with him? Well, they take him to bury him. Do you know whose job it normally was to deal with the bodies? Women. And spices. Did you see the amount of spices that those two old guys brought? Pounds and pounds of it. So what are they doing? They're taking Jesus' body, bloody, beaten, dead Jesus, really, and they're taking him and they're cleaning him and they're wrapping him and putting spice in there so the stench is not too bad. So they're washing him. Tell me something more humble than that. You know what that tells me about those two guys? Those two old Jewish leaders were born again. They were Jesus people all the way. They hid it, they dodged it, they faked it, they watched around the corner, but those two boys were born again old guys. And they washed Jesus' body and they prepared it for burial. And then when they found a brand new empty tomb, they stuck him in it. That's what John tells us. Very interesting. The humility, the boldness of those guys. Very masculine, I'm sure. Maybe doing a feminine thing, cleaning Jesus up. Humility. Jesus can give that back to you. He really needs that from you. He really doesn't need us ego-driven maniacs. He really needs people, humble people who just serve him. So, the gospel does that for us. Reminded that we are more loved than we could ever imagine, and we are more sinful and dangerous than we ever can imagine at the same time. It is those two things. It's the really nice resort and the ghetto at the same time. I've got both in me. I've got a ghetto. I've got a nice resort. And when you recognize that in you, then you know you need to be born again. Joseph and Nicodemus were. We need it too. I even think churches need it to be born again. Leaders need it. Workers need it. It doesn't stop. We're just reminded of the original one. But it happens again and again. I'm so thankful for God's grace. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for the grace that we stand here today in. Lord, we are for sure not standing here because of how good we are.